The Tang Dynasty did not produce Wu Zetian. It tried to bury her. She arrived at the imperial palace in Chang'an at 14. Not as a future ruler, not as a politician, not even as a person the court was required to remember. She arrived as property, a minor concubine assigned the lowest rank in a hierarchy of dozens, in a system where women existed to bear sons for men who held the actual power. Confucian law did not merely discourage female rule. It made the concept structurally incoherent. Like asking water to flow uphill, the throne passed through male blood. The mandate of heaven was a male inheritance. 700 years of imperial China had produced not one exception. Then Taizong died, and the court did what the court always did with women who had outlived their usefulness. It discarded her. She was escorted beyond the palace gates, her silks exchanged for a nun's coarse robe, her name struck from court records. Ganye Temple received her like a drain, receives water as quietly, finally, without ceremony. The system had processed her and moved on. 50 years later, she stood in Luoyang and abolished the Tang Dynasty. Not as a regent, not behind a screen, not in her son's name, in her own. In the palace of Emperor Taizong, Wu moved through corridors lined with lacquered screens and gold-threaded banners, one more teenage girl presented to serve the Son of Heaven. Senior consorts already commanded influence through sons and family alliances, while ministers from ancient clans filled the outer court with memorized precedents and sharpened objections. Every woman inside the inner chambers calculated her survival against the fertility of her rivals and the emperor's passing interest. A concubine without favor vanished into decorative silence. Wu learned the rhythms before she tested them. She watched which ministers lingered after audience and which eunuchs carried gossip between courtyards, and she memorized the emperor's habits. Down to the hour, he preferred military reports over poetry. When summoned, she did not rely on ornament alone, but spoke about campaigns and frontier tribes, drawing on texts she had studied as a girl in her father's household. Taizong listened longer than expected. The extension of a conversation altered her rank more than any jeweled hairpin could. Eunuchs began to note her name with a shade of caution, and rival consorts measured her not by beauty, but by proximity to policy. She adjusted her posture in public audiences, lowering her gaze in ritual submission while positioning herself close enough to hear the emperor's private instructions. Access became currency. Years folded into campaigns against Goguryeo and internal reforms, and Su remained childless, which kept her status precarious even as her familiarity with statecraft grew. The hierarchy inside the palace hardened around mothers of sons, and alliances formed through cradles rather than counsel. She maintained her usefulness by volunteering for tasks others dismissed, copying documents, delivering messages, standing near the emperor when ministers debated supply lines. She built relevance without demanding it. Then Emperor Taizong fell ill. The court's confidence thinned as physicians burned incense and prescribed elixirs, and princes began to measure one another with new caution. When he died in 649, ritual took command of emotion, and the machinery of succession moved without pause. His son ascended as Emperor Gaozong. For the childless concubines, the verdict arrived with the mourning edicts. Palace law required that they shave their heads and withdraw from court life, sent to Buddhist convents to pray for the emperor's soul and erase their own political presence. Silk gowns were replaced with coarse robes, and jeweled combs gave way to bare scalps. Relevance ended overnight. Wu stood among them as attendants cut away her hair. The sound of the blades rasped against her skull while incense smoke thickened the air, and senior eunuchs recited the regulations that stripped her of title and proximity. No petition altered the rule. She bowed with the others and accepted the journey to Ganya Temple. The temple walls rose plain and gray against the hills outside Chang'an, far from the clamor of court memorials and factional whispers. Bells marked the hours instead of drum towers, and sutras replaced state documents. Wu took vows, knelt on woven mats, and lowered her head before statues of the Buddha, formally severed from imperial ambition. By law and ritual, her political life ended there. She followed the discipline without protest. She rose before dawn, copied scripture with steady hands, and moved through the courtyards with the same measured pace she once used before an emperor. Other former concubines surrendered to resignation, trading rivalry for routine. Wu observed the temple's visitors instead. Among those visitors came Emperor Gaozong, honoring his father's memory. He remembered her from the palace corridors, from the measured way she had spoken in Taizong's presence. When their eyes met across the incense haze, recognition replaced monastic anonymity. The rules that had exiled her did not account for memory. After the ceremonies, Gaozong returned to Chang'an, but the encounter lingered. Messages began to move through trusted eunuchs, brief and cautious, testing whether propriety could be stretched without snapping. A former concubine recalling a reigning emperor risked scandal, and scandal invited execution. Inside her cell at Ganya Temple, Wu adjusted her strategy to the new reality. She composed letters that blended devotion with recollection, careful to frame her words as loyalty to the throne rather than desire for return. Each phrase balanced on a blade's edge. If she misjudged the tone, she would disappear into permanent obscurity. Before we move deeper into the palace, intrigues that follow, take a moment to like the video if you're drawn to stories where power is seized rather than inherited. Subscribe if you want more long-form histories where individuals push against systems built to crush them. Your support keeps this channel alive and allows us to keep telling stories at this scale. In the quiet of the temple, Wu waited for a summons that might never come. She kept her robes immaculate, her script flawless, and her correspondence measured, refusing to let exile calcify into surrender. The court had expelled her by rule, but rules required enforcement, and enforcement depended on men who remembered her. The summons from Chang'an arrived without ceremony, carried by imperial envoys who read the decree in the courtyard of Ganya Temple. Emperor Gaozong ordered that Wu return to the palace to serve him once more, bending the convention that should have confined her to monastic life until death. The abbess bowed, the envoys waited, and Wu prepared for a second entrance into a world that had already discarded her once. She crossed the palace threshold with her hair grown long again and her robes exchanged for silk, moving through corridors where servants paused mid-step to stare. Courtiers understood what her presence implied, because a former concubine, recalled from religious vows, signaled imperial desire overriding ritual law. Gaozong received her privately at first, behind painted screens and guarded doors, where memory displaced protocol and familiarity replaced distance. The pattern of his evenings shifted, and the palace kept count. Her reinstatement forced every faction to recalculate. Ministers who had anchored their authority in Confucian orthodoxy drafted careful memorials warning against moral excess, while eunuchs adjusted their loyalties according to which courtyard the emperor favored after dusk. Wu did not demand promotion or press for title. She accepted each invitation with measured gratitude and deferred posture, ensuring that advancement appeared to originate from the throne itself. Favor accumulated through repetition. At the center of the inner palace stood Empress Wang, lawful wife of Gaozong and guardian of established hierarchy. She possessed aristocratic lineage and the backing of powerful clans who had helped secure Tang authority for decades. Wu possessed neither pedigree nor official rank, but she held the emperor's sustained attention, and that attention unsettled the balance that title alone could not guarantee. The rivalry took shape without open declaration. Tension surfaced first in ritual settings where etiquette concealed hostility. At court banquets, Wang maintained composure while observing how often Gaozong directed conversation toward Wu, and how frequently he requested her presence during informal discussions of state matters. Servants received conflicting instructions from competing residences, and minor disputes over ceremonial precedents expanded into formal complaints delivered through intermediaries. Courtesy masked calculation. Outside the inner chambers, ministers divided. Senior officials aligned with the empress invoked precedent and warned that instability in the palace threatened the dynasty itself. Others, sensing where imperial preference leaned, softened their objections and began addressing Wu with a degree of respect reserved for women closer to power. She increased her involvement in discussions of taxation and frontier security, speaking when invited and withdrawing when challenged, ensuring that her counsel appeared useful rather than intrusive. Policy became her instrument. Within the women's quarters, competition sharpened. Wu cultivated alliances among eunuchs and lower-ranking consorts by remembering their family circumstances and rewarding small acts of loyalty, binding them through obligation rather than fear. Empress Wang relied on inherited authority and expected obedience to follow rank, which left little space for personal negotiation. The palace air thickened with scrutiny as each woman measured the other's support. When Wu gave birth to a daughter, the child altered the stakes inside the court. An infant strengthened her bond with Gaozong and signaled potential influence over future succession, even though a daughter could not inherit the throne. Nurses moved carefully through her chambers, and the emperor's visits grew more frequent, each appearance reinforcing her position against the empress's fading dominance. A living child shifted advantage. The advantage collapsed when the infant was found lifeless in her cradle. Palace. Attendance froze as physicians confirmed what could not be reversed, and grief traveled through the corridors faster than official notice. Empress Wang had visited the nursery earlier that day, and servants recalled her presence with sudden intensity once the death became known. Suspicion gathered before morning settled. Wu presented her accusation in private audience with Gaozong, recounting the timing of Wang's visit and the stillness that followed without raising her voice or abandoning ritual decorum. She wept, but her words remained ordered, and she allowed implication to sharpen where direct condemnation might have seemed reckless. The emperor listened while courtiers waited outside, aware that the outcome would determine more than the fate of a single woman. Tragedy turned into leverage. Empress Wang denied involvement and appealed to her lineage and record of propriety, but denial struggled against a narrative shaped by grief. Ministers who had defended her now faced a perilous choice between loyalty to established order and loyalty to an emperor confronting the death of his child. Investigations unfolded within palace walls, guided as much by allegiance as by evidence, and each testimony seemed to press against the empress's position. Her authority thinned under scrutiny. Wu appeared in mourning garments before ancestral tablets, hair unadorned and posture subdued, allowing the image of bereavement to circulate through the court. She did not issue threats or demand punishment. She permitted silence and suggestion to constrict her rival's options. Gao Zong's private audiences shifted further in her favor, and access to the emperor became the true measure of power within the palace. The inner court no longer revolved around title alone, but around whoever controlled imperial certainty. The imperial edict arrived in 655 with seals pressed deep into red wax and language sharpened to cut through lineage. It accused Empress Wang of jealousy, impropriety, and moral failure, listing charges that reframed palace rivalry as dynastic threat. Gaozong authorized the decree, and ministers who had defended Wang watched their objections dissolve under the weight of imperial will. The balance of the inner palace shifted in a single reading. Wu did not appear in the hall when the edict was announced. She remained within her residence, receiving reports from eunuchs who described the expressions of senior officials as the charges were recited. Some lowered their heads in ritual obedience, while others kept their eyes fixed forward, calculating whether resistance would cost them their posts or their lives. Authority moved away from inherited rank and toward the woman who had shaped the emperor's certainty. Empress Wang was stripped of her title and confined to separate quarters under guard. Her silks were replaced with plain garments, and her access to the emperor ended without appeal. Aristocratic clans that had anchored her position petitioned cautiously, invoking precedent and warning against instability, yet none dared challenge the edict outright. Their influence weakened with every silent bow. Wu advanced carefully, ensuring that the removal appeared as the emperor's decision rather than her demand. She attended Gaozong in public audiences with controlled composure, neither triumphant nor deferential beyond measure. When ministers presented memorials, she stood slightly behind the throne, yet close enough to hear each argument before the emperor responded. Presence became proximity to power. Confinement did not end the threat that Wang represented. As long as she lived, factions could rally around the possibility of restoration, and her family name could serve as a banner for opposition. Reports circulated that sympathizers attempted to send messages into her quarters, and guards tightened their watch. The rivalry had moved beyond humiliation into final calculation. An order was issued that closed the question permanently. Empress Wang and consort Xiao were taken from their cells and subjected to a punishment that the court would discuss in lowered voices for years. Not because cruelty was rare in Tang politics, but because the method was designed to be remembered. The news traveled through corridors with a chill that no incense could mask, and even officials accustomed to palace intrigue stopped to measure, quietly and carefully, the cost of crossing the woman who had ordered it. Wu had not merely won. She had sent a message that winning was no longer enough for her. Wu received the report of their deaths without public display. She dismissed attendants, washed her hands in a basin of cool water, and changed into formal attire before appearing at court beside Gaozong. Ministers observed the steadiness of her expression and the absence of hesitation in her step, and in the silence that followed her entrance, ruthlessness had replaced rivalry. With her primary opponent eliminated, the path to formal elevation opened. Gaozong issued another edict naming Wu as empress, citing her virtue, intelligence, and devotion to the throne. Rituals were conducted in the ancestral temple, and she knelt before tablets that recorded generations of male sovereigns and their consorts. The ceremony embedded her within the structure she had just reshaped. Aristocratic resentment did not disappear with the proclamation. Senior clans murmured that precedent had been violated and that fear now governed the inner palace. Yet none could ignore that the emperor stood publicly at her side. Wu acknowledged their bows, distributed promotions to those who aligned with her, and reassigned officials whose loyalty wavered. Reward and removal worked in tandem. As empress, she no longer relied solely on influence through intimacy. She reviewed petitions, commented on appointments, and advised Gaozong during deliberations over frontier campaigns and fiscal reforms. When ministers challenged a proposal, she requested clarification rather than retreating, forcing them to defend their positions in her presence. Authority settled into routine. The court adjusted to the new order, though tension remained coiled beneath ritual courtesy. Officials who had once dismissed her as a former concubine now addressed her with titles that acknowledged her supremacy within the palace hierarchy. Every audience reinforced the reality that opposition had been defeated not by argument alone, but by elimination. Her power rested on the memory of what defiance had cost. Emperor Gaozong's health declined in episodes that interrupted court routine without warning. Headaches blinded him during audiences, dizziness forced him to grip the arms of the throne, and physicians crowded the palace with tonics that failed to restore steady authority. When he could not preside, memorials accumulated unanswered, and ministers waited in tense silence for instruction. Wu stepped into that silence with controlled efficiency. She began issuing decisions in Gaozong's name, reviewing petitions at his bedside and summarizing arguments before presenting conclusions for his approval. When pain kept him from public view, she sat behind a lowered screen during court sessions, listening to debates and directing responses through trusted intermediaries. Ministers adjusted their language, addressing their arguments toward the space where her voice would emerge. Authority shifted from shared consultation to managed endorsement. The change unsettled aristocratic clans, who had tolerated her influence as empress but resisted her visibility as ruler. Senior officials attempted to bypass her by requesting direct audiences with the emperor, only to find access filtered through her attendants. She responded by promoting scholars of modest background who owed their advancement to imperial favor rather than ancestral prestige. Each appointment rebalanced the bureaucracy. Wu evaluated officials not only by lineage but by utility, elevating men who demonstrated administrative competence and loyalty under scrutiny. She transferred outspoken critics to distant posts where their objections echoed less loudly, while retaining those who adapted quickly to the new arrangement. The bureaucracy reshaped itself around incentives she controlled. Patronage became architecture. As resistance grew subtler, she formalized surveillance. A network of informants expanded within the capital, drawing reports from minor clerks, eunuchs, and provincial officials who sought advancement through exposure of dissent. Accusations reached her desk sealed and detailed, describing whispered conversations and unauthorized gatherings. Suspicion acquired documentation. She authorized investigations that did not wait for public defiance. Officials summoned for questioning faced interrogators trained to extract confessions, and those named in reports often discovered that denial carried little weight against written testimony. Arrests occurred before dawn, and families of the accused watched as guards escorted fathers and sons through palace gates. Fear replaced debate. The first sweeping purge dismantled a cluster of high-ranking ministers who had criticized her prominence behind closed doors. Edicts cited conspiracy and disloyalty, and punishments ranged from exile to execution depending on the perceived depth of resistance. Confiscated estates redistributed wealth toward allies who demonstrated unwavering support. Obedience became survival. The consequences extended beyond the capital. Provincial governors recalibrated their correspondence, ensuring that praise for imperial leadership accompanied routine reports. Officials who once relied on clan networks for protection now sought visible alignment with Wu's directives. Silence spread through corridors where open disagreement had once been tolerated. Yet repression carried its own cost. Aristocratic families who survived the purge tightened their coordination in private, sharing intelligence and reinforcing bonds that bypassed official channels. They framed Wu not as regent safeguarding a weakened emperor, but as a usurper rehearsing sovereignty. Opposition organized beneath the surface. Wu responded by narrowing her circle of trust. She consulted a smaller group of advisors whose loyalty she had tested through advancement and risk, and she reviewed sensitive reports without delegating final judgment. Audiences shortened, and access to her presence required layers of verification. Isolation crept into governance. When Gao Zong appeared in public, his presence seemed ceremonial, and courtiers measured the difference between ritual form and operational command. Wu positioned herself beside him during key announcements, reinforcing the perception that decisions flowed through her before reaching the throne. Ministers bowed to both figures, aware that one voice now determined outcomes. Power consolidated around a single axis. Aristocratic resistance did not vanish, but it adapted into coded language and strategic patience. Memorials framed objections as concern for stability rather than challenge to authority, and critics avoided direct confrontation while nurturing alliances beyond immediate scrutiny. Wu tracked these shifts through her informants, adjusting appointments and investigations in response. The court settled into a tense equilibrium sustained by vigilance. Wu's first boundary was not the throne, but her own bloodline. She treated the succession as a mechanism to be adjusted, not a sacred chain that constrained her, and she began by tightening her grip on her son's positions within that mechanism. When an heir resisted her direction or attracted dangerous allies, she cut him loose with the same discipline she had applied to ministers and consorts. The palace learned that being her child did not grant protection. She deposed one son and elevated another, replacing the threat of an independent emperor with the safety of a pliable one. Edicts framed the changes as moral necessity and administrative stability, but officials understood the real message in the speed of the transition. Princes who had built networks around the displaced heir scrambled to survive, severing ties and rewriting loyalties overnight. The Tang legitimacy that ministers defended now depended on a mother's approval. Each manipulation produced ripples that reached beyond the capital. Provincial commanders watched for weakness at the center. Aristocratic clans considered whether the dynasty's ritual order had been corrupted past repair, and opponents of Wu hardened their language in private correspondence. She answered with appointments that favored men who owed everything to her patronage, then reinforced those appointments with surveillance that punished hesitation. Stability became something she enforced rather than something she inherited. By 690, the final step no longer looked like ambition to her court, but like the inevitable conclusion of years of concentrated control. Emperor Ruizong sat on the throne, yet his court moved according to Wu's directives, and ministers delivered their memorials knowing she would decide their fate before any imperial seal was touched. The emperor's authority had become a shell reinforced by ritual, while actual command lived in the residence of the Empress Dowager. The court's pretense required an ending. Wu summoned Ruizong and compelled abdication. The act unfolded with formal language and ritual bows, but the coercion sat in the silent presence of guards and in the knowledge that refusal meant ruin. Ruizong yielded the throne under pressure that could not be recorded in official prose, and senior officials signed what they were ordered to sign because the alternative was annihilation. The Tang line bent under a mother's hand. The moment abdication became fact, the old order lost its last defense. Wu moved quickly to fill the vacuum with new legitimacy, drawing on omens, memorials, and loyal officials prepared to describe her rise as heaven's decision rather than her seizure. Court scholars drafted proclamations that aligned cosmic order with her rule, while priests and monks presented auspicious signs that gave her supporters public vocabulary for submission. The mandate of heaven was treated like a document that could be reassigned. Wu proclaimed a new Zhou dynasty and assumed the title Huangdi, claiming sovereignty in her own name. The declaration overturned centuries of male-only precedent in one stroke, and it forced every official to decide whether they served the throne as an institution or the person who now occupied it. Ministers performed the required rites, yet many did so with faces tightened by fear because a woman emperor did not simply change the ruler. It changed the rules of the universe they had pledged to defend. She appeared in imperial robes designed for male sovereigns, seated where no woman had been allowed to sit, and she received the court's obeisance as if the question had never existed. The spectacle carried its own danger because it offered enemies a symbol around which to rally and gave loyalists a target that could not be disguised behind a screen. Wu responded by treating dissent as treason against heaven itself, tightening the mechanisms of control she had already built. Precedent was not requested, but enforced. Her triumph carried exposure that no earlier victory had required. A concubine could be dismissed, an empress could be condemned, and a regent could be replaced, but an emperor stood alone at the center of blame and revolt. Wu had crossed the ultimate boundary, and she had done it in a system that defined that boundary as sacred. There was no retreat left to her, only rule. With the Zhou proclamation behind her, Wu treated the state as something that could be rewired to outlast personal loyalty. She expanded the Jinshi examination system and pushed it harder into the center of recruitment, elevating men whose credentials came from performance on written tests rather than from pedigree. Candidates from lesser families arrived in the capital with threadbare luggage and sharpened ambition, and they bowed lower to the ruler who had cracked open the old aristocratic gate. Each successful examinee weakened the great clans by proving that birth was no longer the only passport to office. The reforms produced administrators who worked for her with a hunger that lineage had never supplied, but the same reforms sharpened elite hostility into something colder than outrage. Aristocratic households watched commoners take posts once reserved for their cousins, and they turned their resentment into quiet coordination rather than public complaint. Ministers who survived earlier purges learned to praise the exams while funding private networks that maintained clan influence in the provinces. Wu gained loyalty in the bureaucracy, and she inherited a more disciplined form of opposition. Resistance did not stay confined to memorials and salons. Rebellions erupted against the Zhou regime, framed by their leaders as a defense of Tang legitimacy and proper succession, and the slogans traveled quickly through market towns and garrison camps. Local commanders faced a choice between suppressing rebels in Wu's name or hedging their bets until the winner became obvious, and hesitation turned into the most dangerous currency in the empire. Wu demanded speed, and she demanded visible results. Her generals moved with orders that offered little room for negotiation, and the army's victories carried a brutal clarity. Captured leaders were paraded, interrogated and executed, while surviving followers were dispersed or absorbed into units that could be watched. Reports of suppression were read aloud in the capital as proof that heaven still favored the Zhou, yet each announcement also reminded the court that force had become the language of legitimacy. The empire held, but it held under pressure that did not ease. Wu answered the threat of rebellion with another tightening of internal control. Further purges targeted suspected conspirators within the court and across the provinces, and accusations expanded from explicit treason to include ambiguous disloyalty, careless speech, and private correspondence that hinted at Tang restoration. The secret police produced lists that grew longer with each investigation, and officials named on those lists learned how quickly a sealed report could become a death sentence. She rewarded informants and promoted interrogators, turning surveillance into a career path. The purge machinery secured obedience, but it corroded trust at every level of government. Officials avoided frank discussion in meetings and carried their real opinions only in the tension of their faces, while households destroyed letters and burned drafts before servants could glimpse a dangerous line. Even loyal administrators began to fear that success itself could provoke envy and denunciation. Wu received more agreement than ever before, and she ruled a court that no longer dared to speak. As she aged, her body introduced a weakness that policy could not erase. Audiences shortened, travel became rarer, and moments of fatigue forced her to lean on attendants as she moved through palace chambers that once had amplified her presence. Ministers watched the rhythms of her day the way gamblers watched dice, because the empire's future now depended on how long she could personally hold the center. Mortality became a political countdown. Factions began to coalesce around the possibility of Tang restoration, and they did it with patience rather than panic. Princes and senior officials measured which alliances could survive the collapse of the Zhou without exposing themselves too early, and they tested the loyalty of commanders who might decide the outcome in a single night. Wu responded by tightening access to her presence and elevating trusted favorites, but each act of narrowing increased the sense that the ruler stood alone against time. The court bowed as if nothing had changed, yet everyone listened for the first crack. As Wu's strength diminished, powerful ministers and princes stopped waiting for an opening and began manufacturing one. Meetings that once occurred in broad daylight shifted into private residences after curfew, where trusted guards controlled entrances and servants were dismissed early. They spoke in cautious phrases about restoring proper order, yet their plans centered on names, timetables, and which palace gates could be seized first. A failed conspiracy meant execution for entire households, so every participant demanded proof of loyalty before committing fully. The conspirators measured Wu's inner circle as carefully as they measured her health. Favorites who controlled access to her chamber became targets because removing the gatekeepers would isolate the ruler faster than any public proclamation. Ministers tested commanders with small requests and watched the replies for hesitation, while princes gauged which eunuchs could be bought and which would die rather than betray. The opposition did not need to defeat an army if it could cut the head from the palace. Wu sensed the tightening net through the quiet changes of court behavior. Officials who once competed for audience now avoided her gaze and delivered memorials that praised her while asking for fewer decisions, as if they could survive by minimizing contact. She answered by demanding more reports, more verification, and more visible demonstrations of loyalty, forcing ministers into performances that exposed reluctance. Each demand reassured her supporters and sharpened her enemies' resolve. Her health declined in ways that could not be disguised by ceremony. Exhaustion shortened audiences. Trembling hands forced attendants to steady her as she rose, and days of illness left the court without direct instruction, even as petitions piled up in the secretariat. When she could not appear, her favorites spoke for her, and their voices carried none of the authority that her presence had imposed. Ministers learned that the empire could function for short stretches without her, and that discovery changed the atmosphere in the capital. The palace itself began to feel smaller around her. She received fewer visitors, required more layers of permission for access, and surrounded herself with guards whose loyalty she had purchased through promotion and fear. Courtiers noted how often she relied on written reports rather than direct interrogation, and how frequently she postponed audiences that once would have been immediate. Physical weakness translated into political vulnerability with ruthless speed. Restorationists rallied around the Tang lineage and treated legitimacy as a weapon rather than an abstract principle. They circulated private pledges to support the return of the Tang Dynasty, aligning themselves with princes whose bloodline offered a clean alternative to the Zhou regime. Loyalist officials who had prospered under Wu's reforms began quietly opening channels to the Tang faction because survival required options if the palace shifted overnight. The restoration movement stopped being a rumor and became an objective. Wu responded by clinging harder to visible control. She issued edicts that reaffirmed her authority, elevated supporters into strategic posts, and ordered investigations that produced new arrests, meant to terrify wavering officials back into obedience. The purges brought silence, but silence no longer meant loyalty, and the absence of open resistance allowed conspirators to operate behind ritual courtesy. The court bowed deeper while preparing to strike. In 705, the conspirators moved before hesitation could fracture them. They launched the Shenlong coup inside the palace, targeting Wu's gatekeepers first so that orders could not flow from her chamber to loyal units outside. Guards loyal to the plot seized key corridors, and messengers were intercepted before they could reach commanders who might resist. The coup succeeded because it treated access as the true throne. Wu received the first alarm as a disruption in the usual rhythm of attendance when footsteps hurried and then stopped as if someone had ordered silence. She attempted to summon her guards, but the faces at her doorway had changed, and the men who bowed did not meet her eyes. Ministers and princes arrived with rehearsed phrases about safeguarding the dynasty, yet their hands stayed close to their weapons and their bodies blocked the exits. Resistance would have required a chain of command she no longer possessed. They compelled her to abdicate in favor of Emperor Zhongzong, framing the act as restoration rather than overthrow. Documents were presented, seals were prepared, and the ritual language offered her only one path that did not end in immediate bloodshed. Wu signed, and the Zhou dynasty collapsed in the instant ink dried under pressure she could not reverse. Tang rule returned as if it had merely been interrupted. With Zhongzong restored, the palace reorganized around a new center, and Wu's former allies recalculated their survival within hours. Some were executed, others were dismissed, and many rushed to declare that their service had always been to the Tang line rather than to the woman who had replaced it. Edicts stripped Wu of symbols of sovereignty and transferred authority to men who had waited years for this night. The court treated reversal as purification. Wu lived only months after relinquishing power. The restored regime kept her under watch, and her world narrowed to chambers where attendants spoke softly, and guards listened. Her body failed within a political order that no longer required her strength, and she died without reclaiming the center she had once occupied. Her life ended under the dynasty she had displaced. The Tang court, however, did not erase everything she had built, because administration required tools more than it required gratitude. Officials preserved key bureaucratic reforms, including the strengthened examination system that had expanded access to office beyond aristocratic birth, since the state needed competent administrators regardless of the ruler's gender. Men who had condemned her methods still relied on the structures she had tightened, because dismantling them would weaken their own rule. Her institutions outlived her dynasty. If you have stayed with this story through reversals, purges, and the collapse of a self-made throne, like the video and subscribe. This channel follows power as it actually operates, not as later moralists wish it had operated, and your support keeps these long-form histories coming. Subscribing tells the algorithm that this kind of brutal, character-driven history belongs on your feed. History recorded Wu as both usurper and sovereign because the restored Tang needed a villain and could not deny an emperor's reach. The court condemned her ambition while absorbing her administrative machinery, preserving what strengthened the state and rejecting what threatened its lineage. In that contradiction, her legacy stabilized, fixed in memory as the only woman to rule China as emperor. Her rule ended, but it did not disappear.